In this episode, we're covering the Beatitudes, which is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to see how we might look at this as a temple setting and not really a sermon at all. All right, so let's set the stage here for Matthew chapter 5. We're going to focus on Matthew 5 and not Luke 6 here. So we're just going to run down a few of the verses in chapter 5 of Matthew. Jesus has pronounced himself previously as the Messiah in Galilee. And he has gone around, apparently chosen all of his 12 apostles, healed many people, and began to preach repentance. In the last verse of chapter 4, we read the following. And there followed him great multitudes of people from Galilee and from Decapolis and from Jerusalem and from Judea and from beyond Jordan. So he has right away a mass gathering of people based on his miracles and, of course, upon his words. And that's where we end up in chapter 5, where now we're going to start off with a Sermon on the Mount. In chapter 5, verse 1, here's how the chapter opens up for us. And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him. A couple of things that are very interesting about this first verse here. First, he's going up into a mountain, and what is he doing? In a sense, he's giving a law. It's going to be a higher law. And where did Moses go? Again, we've talked about Moses kind of versus Jesus, the way this is being set up theologically among the Jews at this time. He's going back up kind of like a mini Mount Sinai there, if you can even call it a mountain. It's really a hill, but it's a hill that they would call a mountain in Galilee, and that represented a temple. And he's going up to give a new law, just like Moses went up to Sinai to get the law of Moses. He also tells us that and when he was set, his disciples came unto him. This is a really interesting phrase. When he was set, what does that mean? Very possibly, he's setting something up as far as objects go, where he is going to provide a temple type of a setting for his disciples. Because what he's about to go through, starting with the Beatitudes here, is almost for sure a temple setting. This is a temple text. We see, first of all, in chapter 5 and 6 and 7, where we get the entire Sermon on the Mount, a number of words and references that go back to the Psalms. And we know that the Psalms are temple texts. They are songs, they are poems, they are scripts, they are choruses that were used anciently in a temple drama among the ancient Israelites. And a lot of these words are drawn from the Psalms and are used here in the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus. Also, as you know, Jesus repeats the Sermon on the Mount to the Nephites and Lamanites in the Americas in Bountiful. A couple of things that are really important here. First of all, Bountiful is where the temple is. And so we have, again, a temple setting where the Sermon on the Mount is being given. Secondly, critics of the Book of Mormon have brought this up before, why is there basically a cut and paste of the Sermon on the Mount, pretty close, taken from the New Testament and put into the Book of Mormon? Why would this happen? Well, if this is a ritual scene, then it would be appropriate for this to be happening again, where Jesus, just as he did in Israel, is now giving the Sermon on the Mount again because it is a ritual. And perhaps here with, again, having chosen 12 there and having the disciples there, he is going through a similar type of a ritual scenario and presenting the higher law that needs to be given as he has fulfilled the law of Moses. And this is one of the filters we want to use throughout all of Scripture, but especially here in the New Testament. We've talked about the higher and the lower law, and that's a filter we always want to use, not just here in this week's lesson. But another filter to look at the scriptures through is that of a temple setting, a temple script, a temple theology. Oftentimes, the prophets are speaking in temple language. and they're using the temple and its setting and the covenants that are made there, the ordinances, the objects found within a temple. They are using these things as part of their preaching and as part of sometimes the visions that they have are visions of temple imagery, or they are using temple imagery in their preaching. And that is what Jesus is doing here. There are objects within the temple and even places within the temple that Jesus is referring to as he goes through the Sermon on the Mount. John Welch, actually from BYU, is the one who really has found this as a temple setting, the Sermon on the Mount as a temple setting. And he's written extensively on this. And it gets very technical, and we're not going to go through that right now, but I'm going to put down below here in the description of this episode, I'm going to put a link to some of his work, which is fabulous. But going through this type of a filter, understanding that the temple is a part of the Scriptures, helps us to understand that the doctrine that is being drawn by the prophets and given to the people is doctrine that is drawn from the temple. And oftentimes we may go to the temple, we go through the ordinances, we sit and listen, we know we are serving those on the other side of the veil, but there is an immense amount of doctrine that we get specifically in the temple. That is something that has really helped me a lot to understand the Scriptures more and to understand principles of the gospel more, is just really focusing on what I learn as I go through the temple and the doctrine that is presented there that helps me understand more what I find in the Scriptures. And we look then at the Beatitudes, which are found in verses 3 through 11. And each of these verses begins with, "Blessed are they," or "Blessed are ye," but "blessed are" is how they all begin. These are called the Beatitudes because they come from the Latin term beatus, or beatus, which means fortunate or happy or joy. One thing I think about when thinking about the meaning of that term Beatitudes is, number one, thinking of the temple again, is oil. The anointing oil was known as the oil of joy. And so that is a temple term that is used right there. The other would be the tree of life itself is known as a tree of joy and a tree of happiness. And we think about the terminology now. We used to call God's plan more the plan of salvation. Now from the brethren, we usually hear the term plan of happiness. And I think that we can think of the plan of happiness also, not just in a sense of what brings us joy, because it does, but if we put it into a temple setting, we realize that as we get through the temple to our end in the temple, that the plan of happiness is the plan of progression toward the tree of life, which represents joy, represents happiness. Think of Lehi's vision, where he's filled with joy as he gets to the tree of life and partakes of the fruit there. And so that's what the Beatitudes mean. It means joy, and so it puts us a little bit more into a temple type of terminology and setting. One thing I learned recently, going down to verse 5, where it is "Blessed are the meek," from Legrand Baker and Stephen Ricks in their book, "Who Shall Ascend into the Hill of the Lord?" One thing they bring up is that for them, the research that they did, that meek really means covenant keeping. So that was something very interesting to me, that the meek would inherit the earth, but it is the covenant keepers that would inherit the earth, or the obedient that are going to inherit the earth. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Going down to verse 8, "Pure in heart." This is something that's kind of interesting to me. John Welch talks about this being completely an Aaronic priesthood type of a chapter here as we go through the Beatitudes, but I'm not sure that's totally true. Verse 8 is the one where we hear about being pure in heart. And this seems much more like a higher law, a Melchizedek law type of a verse. It's a requirement to reach the Holy of Holies and to see the face of God. And we see this in a number of other scriptures, especially in the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 67, sections 93, sections 95, all talk about being pure in heart as a requirement to get to see the face of God. And again, when we talk about seeing the face of God, we're talking about the temple also. That is a temple reference. It is getting through the veil to see the face of God. And so think of that, and when we talk about, again, that filter, that temple filter in the scriptures, whenever you see the face of God, think of the temple. Think of going through the veil. And as you see the Beatitudes here, the way these apparently seem to be set up is that these are requirements to be able to get into the temple or to progress through the temple. We see this as blessed are they, blessed are thee. Jesus here obviously is talking, or at least he's speaking to his disciples, to his followers here, but he's referring third person to somebody else. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are they who. And then all of a sudden, he changes that. In verse 11, Jesus changes where he says, blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. So he's been in the third person. They've gone through the requirements here of everything that you need to progress or to even get in, possibly to the temple. And now he's addressing them directly, as if maybe now that you've gone through these requirements and agreed to these requirements, now we're addressing you directly as initiates here. This verse 11 makes me think about shame. And again, referring back to Lehi's vision, which could very well be a temple text. A lot of the verbiage there and the principles there are a temple type of a text. But it makes me think about Lehi's vision and the great and spacious building. It is shame that is being cast from the great and spacious building to those that are partaking of the fruit, that are having this joy. So it's almost as if it's a known thing, being that this is ritual and maybe something scripted, that Jesus is saying, okay, now that you've gone through all of these requirements, understand that you may be persecuted and that you may have shame thrown at you because of the way that you're going to live, because of the agreements that you've made here. In verse 13, we talk about the salt of the earth. And again, all I'm going to say on this is we've heard perhaps the idea of salt being part of a covenant because it's used with sacrifices on an altar. All true, but I would add to that we're talking about the altar at the temple, in the temple. So again, it's another reference to the temple. And then 14, verse 14, ye are the light of the world. This would be tied directly to the menorah, or even the tree of life that we would have there, or the light that comes in at the very beginning of the creation story. So this is another temple reference that we have. And now Jesus moves on to talk about the higher and the lower law, something we've discussed a lot in this series. He talks about the law of Moses, and he talks about the higher law that he is now bringing in. And he says in verse 17, think not that I am come to destroy the law. This is a really important point. Or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. So what is the difference there? The difference is that the law of Moses and the Aaronic law have been in place to look forward to the atonement, to look forward to the birth of Christ and his sacrifice. And now he's going to fulfill that looking forward. You know, everything that has been done in the law of Moses and in the Aaronic law, the preparatory gospel, has been to prepare for the coming of Christ. And here he is. And now he's saying something important, which is, I'm not destroying the lower law. It still exists. It still exists even going forward. There are principles that are eternal, that do not go away, that are tied to the preparatory gospel, that are tied to an Aaronic and a lower law, a carnal law. They have to do with temporal things and preparatory things They are things that are tied to what we reach out for to try and move toward God. So our prayers, our obedience, these are all things that would be tied to this Aaronic law. And of course, he's not coming to destroy that. He's coming to add to it, to bring something bigger, which is more of an eternal perspective, a spiritual perspective, and what God is doing for us through the sacrifice, through the atonement. That is the higher law. And then coming down to verse 20, he kind of reiterates this, and he says that your righteousness needs to be greater than that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Well, we probably read that in a cursory manner where we might think, okay, so the scribes and the Pharisees are wicked, and so we need to be more spiritual than them, better than them. But what he's really saying, as we look in the context of this ritual and looking at the higher and lower law, is that they follow a lower law. They follow an Aaronic law, the law of Moses, and you have to have something of greater righteousness than just the law of Moses in order to have salvation. And he backs this up over and over again, saying something along the lines of, ye have heard in times of old, and then he gives an example of the Aaronic law, the law of Moses, and he says, but I say unto you now, and he adds something to it. And so you have a temporal side that has been spoken of up to now, and now you have a spiritual side that he is adding to it. And so we get examples like the following in verse 22. Whosoever is angry with his brother, in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls in connection with a covenant ceremony, they're not able to move forward or progress through that process, through that ceremony, if anyone is angry with someone around them. In fact, there's a punishment that they have. And so all anger toward anybody else has to be removed before they're able to continue to move forward with their ceremony. Again, it's temple imagery that we have here. And in the Book of Mormon, as he around the time that he's giving the Sermon on the Mount, he says that you have to be reconciled with everyone before you can even come to him. So it's a very similar type of imagery and principle here of being able to progress and move forward. And then we get additional temple imagery that we find throughout this chapter with adultery in marriage, with oaths, with God's throne and his footstool. These are all places or items or principles that would have been in the ancient Israelite temple. And then Jesus brings up something more directly, and that is justice. Justice is a part of the lower law. And the way he brings up justice is the phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We've heard that many times. And that's what that means. It means justice. It's important. And of course, you can't get rid of that. You can't get rid of justice. But what you need to do is add mercy onto justice. You need both of them. That's the lower law and the higher law. The justice is something that we cannot avoid. It is the cherubim in front of the tree of life. There's no way around it except through Christ and through the higher law that he is now presenting here. And a great example of that higher law is that previously in the chapter, if we back up a little bit, he talks about being persecuted, basically your enemies attacking you. And blessed are ye for being persecuted for my name's sake. But now he takes it even further, and he says, not only are you going to be persecuted, but you need to love those that persecute you. That is a tough concept. It really is. I mean, I don't know how pervasive that type of an idea would have been at that time. It's not a very mainstream idea now, certainly not in practice. But here he says something that just seems such a reach spiritually, that those that hurt you, those that harm you, those that persecute you, those that hate you, those that are your enemies, that you need to love them regardless. Charity, right? Separate the sin from the sinner, especially even when it's directed at you. That is, to me, is a really profound teaching. Something that, as I think about that, there have been times in my life where, wow, that takes a lot of digging down deep to try and find that kind of, and what would be the word for that? It's not really just spirituality, is it? And it's not really just strength. It's love, maybe. To find that deep down inside of you, that is a very profound thing and a very difficult thing to do. And here he is saying this is part of the higher law. It seems like, to me, that goes right to the heart of Christ's teachings, doesn't it? Seems to me like it does. And of course, in the end of Christ's mortal life, that's what he does. Where he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and he takes on all of our sins. And especially for those of us that know better and have received some light and some knowledge and have practiced principles, both whether we're inside the church or outside of the church, and have seen goodness and been exposed to that goodness, if we have wronged somebody else or not followed through on those principles, then in a sense of proxy, in a way of proxy, we have harmed Jesus Christ. We have been a part of the burden that he took on himself in the Garden of Gethsemane and on the cross. And so he loves us anyway, despite our imperfections, despite our wrongdoings. He loves us and still does, and did the greatest act of all time and the greatest suffering of all time to show that love for us and to back up what he said. He doesn't just talk the talk, right? He walks the walk. And that's what we're supposed to do. And then the chapter ends in verse 48 here. And this is a verse that most of us have heard or read several times before. And as we said about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we are asked to be perfect here. Be ye therefore perfect. We're asked to be perfect after all these things that he's just gone through. So he's bringing these disciples through these requirements to help them to progress forward through this ritual and these covenants probably. And then he tells them how they need to act once they've accepted these covenants. And then he says to them, be ye therefore perfect. But of course, the problem with that is justice, because we're not. And so how do we become perfect when we're not perfect? And that's part of the atonement. That's what the atonement is for. Now, an interesting difference in the Sermon on the Mount, or as John Welch calls it, the Sermon at the Temple in the Book of Mormon, is that the word therefore is moved in the phrase. And instead of be ye therefore perfect, it is therefore I would that ye should be perfect. So what this does is this turns this into a transitionary phrase, a transitionary verse, where, okay, you've gone through all of these things, now, or therefore, you're going to be perfect. You need to be perfect at this point. And this is, again, an ascension text, as we would call it. You're moving up the glories, or you're moving up the requirements. You're moving through the progression of a temple until you get to perfection. And as now President Nelson covers in the manual, he talks about the Greek word for perfection, which is teleos. And there's a couple of additional things that we might want to add to this word that gives us a little bit of meat. And that is, this is the term that was used for temple religions. So religions that would have a temple would use this when they went through their temple rites, as they would call them, mystical rites, or the mysteries. We see that term often in the scriptures, mysteries. We should think about the temple when we see that word, the mysteries of God. Nephi wanting to know the mysteries of God. That is a reference to the temple and the covenants that are there and the doctrine that is in the temple. Even more specifically, it's a reference to the Sod, which is the council in heaven, and the mysteries and the words that are spoken in the council in heaven, in the pre-existence, and now even the council that's held in heaven. And that is what the mysteries refer to. And teleos is a reference to one who goes through those mysteries or through those covenants and makes it to the end of those temple rites. And they then end up perfect. And so that is, again, a temple term and a temple reference. A great reference in the New Testament to compare this chapter to is the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is where we talk about Christ as the Melchizedek, the new Melchizedek. But this term teleos is used in chapters 5 and 6, and it helps us to distinguish between what is required in the lower law and what would be used in the higher law. And directly in Hebrews chapter 9, this word is used for the heavenly temple. And throughout the book of Hebrews, or the epistle of Hebrews, the word is used when putting someone in a position where they can stand before God or see the face of God or come into the presence of God. So we get a better idea of what that perfect means in verse 48. Be ye therefore perfect, or in other words, reach the end game here. Like the term we heard in the movie Field of Dreams, go the distance. An interesting quote by Joseph Smith says the following: I advise all to go on to perfection and search deeper into the mysteries of godliness. So here, the term mysteries and the term perfection, which in the Greek would be teleos, are used together by Joseph Smith here in a temple type of a phrase. So we start off in chapter 5 with Jesus ascending a mountain like Moses to give a new law and setting things up. And then we walk through the requirements to move forward, and then we're addressed directly as to how we need to act once we receive those requirements and make those covenants. And then we are told to be perfect, which would be at the end of that ascension or the end of that temple progression. And it also transitions us into chapter 6 and chapter 7 with the rest of the Sermon on the Mount that continue to bring us through this temple imagery. We'll talk to you next time. If you like this series on Come Follow Me, be sure to like this episode and to subscribe.